Good evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are in our beautiful world, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a new episode of Polaris, the podcast for dissidents. And today we will be talking about what elements caused the rise of Hitler, and was this all orchestrated, or was it a devious plan by either the parties getting him into power, or a devious plan on the part of the Nazis? Hans has written a nice article, or it's a part of a book, I guess, that he wrote, and it's exactly about this topic. We will not be reading the entire section, but Hans will now proceed and give us a brief overview of what the article or section of the book means. Hans.
Thank you, Sietse. I'll try to be as brief and concise as I can be. It's a chapter from a book on the second on the 20th century in Europe, history of Europe, which is an overview. So it's not a very detailed overview, as overviews tend to be. They need to be sort of more generalizing. The basic thing is this: that the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, was founded in the early 20s in Germany. And they were immediately very well favored by big captains of industry in the Netherlands, in France, in America. Ford used to give them money very early on. And they have always been able to count on much support from business circles in Germany, but also outside Germany. And when you look at the behavior of the German voters in the German elections during the 1920s and 30s, you can tell that the Germans increasingly felt attracted to the Nazi Party. And at a certain point, 37% voted in favor of the Nazi Party, but also 13% in favor of the Communist Party, which gives you the conclusion that half of the German population, at least, was in favor of not in favor of a democracy, as they call it, but of a dictatorship of the proletariat, or of Hitler, or the Nazis, or whatever. So, and these are things that are usually not mentioned in histories, in overviews of the 20th century or of German history. It's always swept under the table, under the carpet. And but it's good to know and to reflect upon the fact that Hitler was supported by many people, many businessmen, powerful businessmen in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in France, in Belgium, all over the place, Czechoslovakia. And this means that he was not a lone wolf, an idiot, a fool with some crazy nutty message, but he actually struck a sensitive chord among people who were supposed to know about things, and also the banks supported him, etc., etc. So this means that Hitler was not a figure that came falling out of the blue just like that, and suddenly became dictator of Germany against the wishes of the majority of the population. That's the idea. So that's more or less the I think the gist of what I wrote. Yes.
All right. Well, I think that's indeed quite an accurate description of your piece. So I would like to ask Charles if you would like to, commence with your first commentaries on this issue.
Well, I was thinking about reading a passage from this book by Jim Marrs, the American writer. He's actually a Texan, called The Rise of the Fourth Reich. And maybe I can make it a little bit shorter than the original passage that I referred to. And it's about the connection between the creation of communism and then the creation of National Socialism as a response to communism. And there are mention of different families in America, just the names, and Marrs's sort of thoughts on this subject: creation of communism, then the creation of National Socialism. So near the beginning of his book, I'll take my glasses off here. He states that mystified conspiracy researchers were puzzled for years about why such high-level capitalists as the Morgans, Warburgs, Schiffs, and Rockefellers could condone, much less support, and ideology that overtly threatened their position and wealth. Because before this point, he's talking about how these different families helped to finance the Bolshevik Revolution. So he says that author Gary Allen explained, in the Bolshevik Revolution, we have some of the world's richest and most powerful men financing a movement which claims its very existence is based on the concept of stripping of their wealth, men like the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Schiffs, Warburgs, Morgans, Harrimans, and Milners. But obviously these men have no fear of international communism. It is only logical to assume that if they financed it and do not fear it, it must be because they control it. Can there be any other explanation that makes sense? The manufactured animosity between the democracies of the West and the communism of the East produced continuous tension from 1918 through the end of the 20th century. This is Mars making this statement. But it threatened to get out of hand. Some researchers believe that the threat of worldwide communist socialism caused these globalists to turn to German nationalists. They funded the rise of National Socialism in Germany and saw an armed Greater Germany as a barrier to communism in Europe. National Socialism was a form of socialism almost indistinguishable from communism, only it was confined within national geographic boundaries. Under National Socialism, the globalists could pit the various nations against each other. But following Germany's military successes in Poland, the Low Countries, and France, these globalists realized they faced the same problem that they had with communists. A total German victory would result in a worldwide National Socialist system, unable to produce the tensions and conflicts necessary for maximizing profit and control. They also may have feared that Stalin's Soviet Union was about to launch an attack on Western Europe. Only Hitler's Germany had the strength to prevent this. At some point, the globalists determined that the Axis, after blocking Russia's invasion of Europe, should lose the war. Close quote. So some of this is not original to Mars, but I thought that was a good little summary of one perspective on the connection between the rise of communism and then the later rise of National Socialism, which takes it out of the hands of Hitler specifically or his small group. I wonder what Hans might say about some of these statements that Jim Mars makes.
Well, they sound completely logical and natural to me, and I don't think I could argue with them, and I could disagree with these arguments in a fundamental way. The problem with history is always that you need sources, and you need sources that undoubtedly, without any question, support your a certain point of view. And on these sort of building blocks, you can then, with such building blocks, you can then build your story, your overview, your history, write your book, and that's very often not possible. So very often you have to you have to infer things, you have to conclude things from secondary evidence, of tertiary evidence even. And it's very difficult always in history to find the real hard facts. And whenever you find them, you can be very happy, but very often those facts are not about the things that you would like to have facts from. So as I said, this book Mars is correct. And what he said about these families in America, the same has been said by a French author about France, about listing all these families in France that supported the Germans. And you can make a similar list of families in other countries. So the number of people that supported Hitler was tremendous, that supported the National Socialists. And why they did so can only be inferred from the events in the Second World War. And it's very probable that Mars is right, and that it was just an engineered thing. That's what economists like Richard Werner also said. All big wars, at least since the 17th century, 18th century, are engineered by a small group of people, and they're always they never go about what the history books tell you they're about. They're always about some other issue that is not mentioned, but it's difficult to pinpoint that and to really prove that. But the secondary evidence, tertiary evidence, all points to the fact that all these wars, Second World War, First World War, the 19th century wars, the wars of the 18th century, they were all engineered by groups of people that sort of set up others to achieve their ends. So I would agree, yes.
All right. Thank you, Hans. Alexander, I was curious about your vision and opinions on this matter.
Yes, good evening, Sietse. Thank you, and thanks also to Hans for another quite good contribution to our podcast series. In this case, about the ultimate conspiracy, because of course this is handling conspiracy upon a conspiracy. So Hitler is said to have come to power on the basis of a conspiracy theory, and now we are talking about a conspiracy theory explaining why he came to power using that conspiracy theory. So we are here in quite tricky territory. Nevertheless, the issue is a valid one, not only from a historical point of view, but also from a philosophical point of view, because we tend to forget, if you're looking at these historical events that have shaken Europe, destroyed Europe to a certain extent, the upsets, what I call the Red Revolution and the Black Revolution, because that both were communist as well as the fascist and National Socialist revolutions, were in fact counter movements, predictable in a certain sense. And in this case, predictable not only, but also manipulatable. So they could be manipulated by greater forces quite easily if you look from a philosophical perspective. So let's take the traditionalist standpoint, Evola. But this matches quite nicely with the National Socialist point of view as well, the philosophical point of view, as for example stated by Sophie Davy. So the traditionalist point of view and her point of view was that what happened during the Black Revolution, I call it, the National Socialist Revolution, was inevitable. So both its rise and its demise were inevitable from a greater macro historical or even cosmological point of view. They were phenomena that fitted to a certain stage in the decay cycle of the tradition. So tradition being the old systems that Europe knew till about 1500, with leftovers surviving into the 19th and 20th century. The moment that these traditional structures, so let's say the Habsburg Empire, the Romanov Empire, to a certain degree the Hohenzollern Empire, the Ottoman Empire fell, at that moment the world was in the hand of modernism, modern state governments, modern capitalist rule as well. And it was inevitable that there would be a reaction to that newly established rule. In certain sense, of course, it fitted the overlords of the new system that was in charge. Let's call it the liberal system or the proto-globalist system. It fitted these overlords to use the existing societal tensions that of course were inevitable after the fall of these traditionalist empires, to use them to their own benefit, including the creation of wars, such as Hans has pointed out. So I think from a traditionalist, from a philosophical point of view, everything that happened during the 20th century, these red and black revolutions, uprisings, they were inevitable, and their end was inevitable as well. So Sophie Davy put it in a very poignant way. She said, there are people that are in time, functioning in time. There are people that function above time, and there are people that are historical figures that function against time. So an example of somebody that stands over time is a traditional ruler. So let's say the pharaohs of Egypt. She used it as an example. These people search for eternity values and try to uphold an anagogic system in their societies. Then there is the ruler in time that tries to make efficient use of the time to establish worldly equilibrium. And she used Genghis Khan as an example. It could be applied to some other figures as well. And the third type is the man and the ruler against time. And for her, the Austrian painter was the ultimate reincarnation of that principle. Somebody that was fighting dark forces in a dark time and whose defeat was inevitable. So and here we come to a philosophical question as well, and this is irrespective of the machinations and the manipulations and the undoubted involvement of these larger, let's say, proto-capitalist, globalist forces, bankers, and so on, irrespective of their involvement, the phenomenon that happened, the events that they triggered, these events, they can be deduced from larger historical forces. The manipulations merely use forces and energy fields that are already present, that are already incarnated. And from that point of view, it doesn't matter too much to what degree these forces were able to manipulate to this way or to that way, whether they set up the Third Reich for failure in 1941 or 40 or 38, it all doesn't matter too much because the larger overall trajectory was clear from the beginning and that is an important point from a traditionalist point of view to add, they were willed. So it is not only that power structures, proto-globalist power structures can be legitimately discerned as having played a role, but that also the forces that they unleashed and that they set up against each other, including the fascist and the nationalist socialist empires and countries, that these countries and forces, they embraced their fate. This is a difficult thing for most modern people to understand. But in a certain sense, the fatalism with which Germany, for example, from 1942 onwards, fought its war, is in fact a kind of proof of this thesis. And of course, there have been many last stands during the 20th century in Europe in particular, but also elsewhere. So I think whatever the larger thesis, and I believe it's certainly historically interesting and historically valid, the larger picture should not be forgotten, and the authenticity and the sincerity with which people fought for their causes, even if they didn't overview the larger geopolitical and larger proto-globalist plots, this doesn't matter because the motivations and the intentions were sincere and authentic. That's what I wanted to say in the first instance.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Alexander. I think that in this discussion, we do have to make a very important sort of demarcation in his rise to power, and that is, of course, the year 1933, when he actually became Reich's chancellor. There's a very interesting book by a man called Turner, and it is called German Big Business and the Rise of Adolf Hitler. And what he has done is go into all the archives of Kruppstahl, of IG Farben, of all the major German industrial conglomerates and international companies. And he found actually that before 1933, they did very little to get Hitler into power. And virtually all finances were the result of the revenue of membership of the NSDAP party and donations and by public support, by popular support. And after 1933, when it became clear what the Nazi economic policy was and that it promised a certain integration of big business with the state, then certain big industries saw their opportunity and helped Hitler, but not uniformly. This is what Turner said, right? So, but there is, of course, we can talk about capitalists as if they're an entire category of inhuman beings who are solely motivated by profit. There were also people who genuinely cared about Europe and its people, and they hopped on the bandwagon of National Socialism because they saw that it offered an opportunity against all of the chaos and against communism. Because, of course, there were capitalists that were genuinely worried about communism, just as Charles said, as it would strip them of their wealth. But there's another very interesting writer that mentioned that, and I forgot his name, but communism basically is international capitalism. Well, because what is communism? It's the erasure of any national frontier, any obstruction against the free-flowing capital of major industries. And here is something again we can see, for instance, in the French Revolution, because you would say that they wanted to kill off all of the aristocracy, but they didn't. They abolished the institution of aristocracy and of nobility, but many of these people were allowed to remain in their castles and in their estates and in their, privileged positions, of at least of estate and of property, but they were stripped of their titles and of their nobility. And I forgot my train of thought for a moment here, but the point is that the Hitler, well, what I was going to, I guess, is that there was Charles said, or Alexander, there was this engineering of the wars, and this, yeah, that's what I was going to. So the engineering of these things you can see a long time back into history. And of course, just as Hans said, banks have a tendency to finance both sides of the war, because no matter who wins, you come out a winner. And I think this is especially pertinent to the case between, communism and National Socialism. But it's not exclusive to this conflict, as we already said. So when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and this is sort of a rumor, but semi-historical, there was an agent of the Rothschild Bank present at the battlefield, and the moment he saw that Napoleon was being defeated, he hurried back to England and said, "We lost the war," and they crashed the stock market there. And when it became apparent that France won, they could cash in on their gamble or their misinformation. And this is the modus operandi of these large financial concerns. Of course, they manipulate and they lie, but I do want to stress that even though large financial interests may have facilitated the engineering of such a war, we must not create the idea that there was not a genuine conviction and a genuine philosophy behind National Socialism. It's not like they created a puppet and financed him and made him a Reich's chancellor. He wrote, of course, his 2-volume book, Mein Kampf, but there's an entire philosophy behind it with an entire department of the SS that created its philosophy, National Socialist philosophy, and school education materials and manuals on what the SS actually stood for on National Socialism. They had entire books for the Hitlerjugend that explained what race and blood was, and tradition, and the roles of boys and the roles of girls. So it was a genuine force, and that organically gained traction among the German population, because it told them, no one is coming to our rescue. We have to fight for ourselves. We have to rely on our own labor. We have to be proud of what we are and what we do. And if we do not, it is the end, because the one thing you have is your folk, your people. And if that is destroyed by the war, then we have nothing left, and it is better to be dead. And a large degree of the population accepted this, because they saw, after the First World War, the seething amount of hatred that was unleashed on Germany. It is extraordinary. I don't think there has ever been a propaganda campaign in the entire history of the world with so much hatred, aimed at the German people and the state of Germany itself. So yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. Hans, after hearing all of us, I was wondering if you would like to comment.
Yes, certainly. First of all, thank you, Alexander, for your insight and your comments. What I suggest we do, or one does, one should do, is to separate the motivations from the industrialists and the bankers from those of the people that voted for Hitler and the National Socialists. They're two distinct sort of fields of thought, fields of feeling and sentiment, what have you. And I think the voters for Hitler and for the National Socialists, like the voters for fascism in Italy, they wanted certain things they wanted to preserve certain values in their life. They didn't want to to live in a corrupted society. They didn't want to have communism. They didn't want to have the kind of horrible society that they were developing in Russia, in the Soviet Union, which caused a lot of problems and destroyed the entire agricultural class, farmer class. And on the other hand, the Nazis and the fascists, they supported agriculture like nobody else. We all know the pictures of Mussolini with without a shirt, handling a spade in support of agriculture in Italy. So there are two different currents of thought and of motivation here. And what we should not forget is that for big business, and that's why you say, you rightly say that after 1933, German big business massively began to support Hitler, as they had been doing, big business had been doing in Italy. Fiat and Ansaldo and all the big corporations, they supported fascism like nothing else, because fascism gave them a bigger market and helped them sell their products better than anything else. So there was a natural reason for big business to support fascism, National Socialism. They became it was for their own benefit, and the same for the population, the voters. They wanted to have something a healthy society where their money was worth something, where their work, their labor was being appreciated, well paid, where they could have a decent family, where they could have decent lives. And it was impossible after the First World War because of the crisis and because of the destruction wrought by the victors, by the blockades of the English of Germany, and by the treason that committed against Italy for winning its share in the First World War. So I think there are two main currents, and I think also that one should point to the fact that in Italy you had the same ideas roughly as you had in Germany, supporting Hitler. And Italy is the country in Europe where after the war you had a really fascist party. The Italian fascist party counted maybe with between 5 and 10% of the votes, from memory. I don't know if I'm correct. And they were very popular. Giorgio Almirante in the 1960s and 70s were very popular. And in Italy, fascism lived on after the war. In Germany, it did not. It was forbidden. But in Italy, it did. And we currently see a revival of these things in Europe. So that's what I would like to point out. Thank you. That's so far.
Yes, Hans, thank you very much. Well, maybe a little digression. What I always find fascinating is the term fascism, because I don't think that National Socialism was actually fascism.
I agree.
Mussolini was much more of the fascist, and he wrote the Fascist Manifesto, and it is really about the all-powerful state. It is nothing outside the state, nothing beyond the state, and nothing excluding the state, whatever. So, and I believe, well, there's this quote circling about, and they say that Mussolini said this, but that fascism is the total integration of the state and industry, or of the state and capitalism, something like that. But of course, it is fascism comes from the Latin word fasci or fasciae, which is a bundle, and this comes from the Roman Empire already, where you have this bundle of reeds with one axe in the middle. So a reed on its own is weak, but when you have a bundle of reeds that has an axe, you can strike with force, and that's exactly the idea of fascism: out of many, one. Hans, I see.
May I say something on this?
Yes, of course.
A characteristic of fascism, like in Portugal corporatism, was that each you had no classes. That's the idea of fascism. You had professional groups arranged around a certain activity. you had like farmers, but also millers and all these other people associated with farming and this production. And you had industrialists, but they were the same category as workers and as managers in factories. So, and sort of political representation was based on these categories, not on horizontal lines, but on vertical lines, also like fascists, like the fasces of
Yeah.
fascist bundle. So that's the main idea. And Italy actually had a parliament or a popular representation based on this system, which is, and Portugal did also. And it's
Yeah.
good to keep this in mind. And I think Mussolini may have said that it was the fusion of the state with big business or with industry. But nobody has done so much for agriculture in Italy as Mussolini. He was really the darling of the farmers. And you can still go travel through Italy and see on farm buildings outside in the country, fascist slogans withered away, but you can still see them, supersede them. We're extremely popular in the countryside
Yes.
among the farmers. So that's, and the same with sort of in practice, the practical sort of outcome of fascist rule was very similar to the practical outcome of National Socialist rule in Germany, as far as the support of the family and of farming and of traditional values, I think. So maybe we should.
Yes, of course, and there are parallels, but of course, Nazi ideology was also about your own labor and your own strength and all of that. But one of the hallmarks of fascism is also a sort of personality cult. And Mussolini was much more of a vanity guy, hanging up portraits of himself and making statues. This is something that, as far as my knowledge goes, in Nazi Germany didn't really happen. Hitler did not like the idea of portraits of him hanging everywhere because, in his own view, he was just an instrument for a certain force. He was not responsible as an individual, as a mere human for what was happening. There was a force of 80 million Germans speaking through him, as Carl Jung said. But there are some differences. And Charles said, I agree. So I was wondering, Charles, if you might like to add your 2 cents on this.
Well, I want to make two major points here. The first point has to do with the philosophy of history, the ultimate causes of events in history. How does one explain events in history overall? And a lot of these theorists are sort of begging the question because they assume an economic explanation. Like Jim Marrs goes into the economics of the rise of National Socialism and talks about all these people funding it. And I think that this is another war on the human mind that has lasted for over 100 years in trying to convince everyone that events in history happen because of economic or socioeconomic causes. But that is not necessarily the case. A competing explanation would be great personalities or great men throughout history are the ultimate causes of changes in history, the rise of regimes. And so there's this other war on sort of putting Nazi Germany in a box through the means of making people understand it in socioeconomic terms, rather than in terms of spirit, the human spirit, or the need to transgress boundaries or something like that. And so the other point I want to make is connected to this one, and that is that can we say that Nazi Germany actually lost the war? And I don't mean because of who may have positions of power in the United States or other nations around the world who survived prominent Nazis or something like that. I'm talking about in the larger scheme of things. You look at history and you look at different cultures warring. The Carthaginian Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, there were three major wars that lasted a couple of 100 years. And so if you lived during the time of the Second Punic War, you may not have predicted that there would be a third Punic War. Now, Rome won all three Punic Wars, but this is not necessarily the same way that it will play out throughout history. So we have World War I and World War II. We're in the middle of things, possibly. Maybe there will be a third war that will decide the fate of everyone based upon the first two wars, but there seems to be a lot of symbolic elements to the Nazi regime and to World War II, where you could argue that the alleged death of Hitler, the alleged end of the Third Reich, was only the beginning of something larger. People have often made fun of this idea of a 1,000-year Reich and saying it only lasted 12 years, or wherever you want to gauge the beginning of the regime. But that's not really looking at it from a larger perspective, a mythic perspective, as a sort of a in illo tempore, the beginning time. That's not exactly the way to gauge events like this that create a new era in human thinking. So you could argue that if Germany would have literally won World War II, that would not be as good an outcome as them losing it, because by losing it, they created a curiosity around the world that sort of germinated over time in that way of thinking about things.
Germinated. Nice.
Yes, I got that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting thought. And of course, Spengler already said that in the breaking down of our European culture, that it will turn to chaos and a new Caesar will rise. And this is, of course, the exact same circumstance and things that happened after the First World War in the Weimar Republic. And I would like to add that perhaps Nazi Germany did survive because there are sources that said that they set up camp in Antarctica and have a very advanced society. But let's not go into that conspiratorial corner for now. Alexander, I was wondering if you have some things to add.
Well, I think that Charles's last remark hit the nail. So the larger historical perspective is, in the end, the most important one, necessarily the most important one. So the macro historical perspective, and this is of course related to narrative, so the mythology, as he said. So the story here is more important than the chain of events. The overall arch of history is what in the end also decides the events. So there are fluctuations, there are triggering mechanisms, there are chains of events that can be distinguished, but the overall arch is something that is, of course, most difficult to perceive. Now, of course, you brought up Spengler, Cesar, so that's an important source, of course, for us, because if you look at Spengler's perspective, then also we can tie up history as it has been written by professional historians with the larger traditionalist perspective, the cosmological perspective, because this is in fact a bridge. Spengler, he proposes the downfall of Europe, das Abendland, so the evening country, and he does that in a very specific way. He draws attention to the greater cycle, which cosmologists know as the great cycle of the white boar, the great white boar. So that's a very large cycle of history in which the penultimate phase is guided by the West. And I think here, to understand this overriding arch, it goes beyond most people's comprehension. Very simply because we lack the narrative, we lack the words, we lack the insight, the concepts even, to understand this time, this larger cycle. This is not something true of earlier ages. So even the Christian cosmological cycle, the other religious cosmological cycles, they give clues to people, they allow them to come to grasps with the larger macro historical arc. And I think here we have to come back to something that I said in the beginning, namely the conspiracy aspect of what we're talking about here. Because, of course, this is generally this thesis that Hans put forth, that greater proto-globalist forces had a great hand in bringing to power both the red and black revolutions in Europe, so the communist and the national socialist revolutions, the fascist revolution as well. So how to understand this, how to come to grip with that phenomenon? I think here we come to the point of the conspiracy as not only as a philosophical tool, because that's what it also is. It's a method, it's a heuristic tool to understand history, conspiracy theory. But it's of course also a wheeled instrument. It is also something that can be manipulated. The conspiracy theory itself is a very powerful instrument. And here I would like to draw attention to the two opposing principles that we see in the 20th, late 20th and 21st century, probably having their roots already in the 18th century, namely the veiling, the covering of public life, and the unveiling, on the other hand, of science. So at the same time that we have the great technological revolution, the scientist revolution, this is an uncovering of hidden mechanisms, and I will explain that a little bit. On the other hand, we have the veiling, the covering of political mechanisms. So political power in the past used to be very in your face. It used to be a person, a king, a nobleman. Now that's of course what we are seeing now. Greater forces now, the greatest forces in the world, are hidden. They do not present themselves in a personal, tangible form to people. This, of course, gives rise to these conspiracy theories as well. And it is undeniably true that in the world today, the people that are in real power, you cannot see them. They do not represent, they don't present themselves, and they do not state their programs, and they don't state their ambitions and their goals. So, on the other hand, we have the unveiling. What I said, we have this scientific revolution, and what becomes available to people is a mechanism to understand facts and events that has never been seen before. So, give an example. Marxist economic theory, no matter what you think about the political goals of the communist movement, unveils a mechanism that is very real, an economic control mechanism and the growth of the modern capitalist system. And it makes people understand it, and it gives people a tool to act against it. Whether you like what came out of communism or not, that does not matter. It becomes a tool. We should also not forget that National Socialism did not automatically invalidate Marx's thesis on economy. It rather opposed their political evasion in the sense of a communist program. Another example of how science has been unveiling facts to people. Biology. So whatever we think about Darwin's theories, it is undeniable that the Darwinism applied to economics and social events is a fact of life. So he has been instrumental, Darwin has been instrumental in making people understand forces of biological evolution, of competition, and allow people to extrapolate those forces to other terrains. The third example is linguistics. So the science of linguistics has unveiled mechanisms that are universal of language formation, of how language is built. So, for example, verb systems, substantive verb systems, that all has been allowing people to understand language. The same kind of revelation mechanisms have been given to people in other sciences as well, sociology, anthropology, and so on. And I think this battle between the unveiling of scientific facts, allowing people to understand the world around themselves, and on the other hand, the veiling, the covering of political forces, they have been in a kind of a thesis-antithesis situation. And I think this larger conspiracy theory that we are talking about today should be understood as such. So we ourselves talking in these terms about the events, the political events of the 20th century, in the sense of a conspiracy theory. This itself, we should understand, is embedded in a larger structure, in a larger narrative. It's part of a larger dialectical process. And I think it's very important for people that really want to understand history to keep this in mind, because the conspiracy theory as such, it is a part of this dialectic that is going on. And to reach the correct balance between them is quite difficult, and is also not something that is encouraged by the powers that be, because of the veiling of political power is in the interest of those who possess that power at the moment. And of course, the opening up of information can also be used in a bad sense. The more information is given to people, the more facts are presented to people, the more brain power and the more analytical power is required of people to come to terms with these new facts, instead of being able to synthesize them, as has been the goal of traditional systems. That's what I wanted to add.
All right, thank you, Alexander. Hans or Charles, do any of you want to comment? Hans, yes?
Just a brief note, because thank you very much, Alexander, for your sort of clear outlining of the division between veiling and unveiling. But I would like to make some sort of correction or remark to relativize a little bit of what you said about the unveiling of sciences by the sciences. Because if we look at medical science today, we see that medical science, especially since the COVID, but also before, medical science does everything to veil things, to veil realities. And there's a whole. It's a pity that Michael Palmer is not here today with us, because he could give more information, more detailed information on this issue. But medical science, as a friend of mine said the other day, it's totally wrong. It's built on wrongful assumptions, and everything that has been introduced into medicine since the 1980s is wrong. And the basis of current medical science is just plainly wrong, erroneous. Everything should be redone from scratch. That's the way medical science, where medical science stands today. So if this is true for the medical science, I wonder for what sciences this is also true. So that the veiling of reality is not only a matter of politics, but also of medical science, and maybe, God knows, of other sciences as well. So maybe we're in the process of where many things are being veiled, and we're only where there's not really unveiling of things, only veiling. Sorry, that's what I would like to comment or to add. Thank you.
Charles, I think you undoubtedly had something to say about that.
I have something to say. Well, okay. I think that the attack on Adolf Hitler, the rhetorical attack that has lasted for 80 years, whether you agree with him or not, or like him or not, is part of a larger attack on the heroic perspective on life and the reality of heroes. Whether you believe a given individual is a hero or not is a different question. But just to believe in heroes who lead groups of people is a problem for the modern perspective, because they want, again, to explain things by appealing to forces that are only understood by specialists. If you can appeal to an individual personality, that's something anyone can do. Anyone can see this great leader and say, he is the cause of such and such. But it takes specialists who have studied some subject matter, some esoteric matter in some esoteric way that most people can't compete with, they can't understand, they can't argue with. If those are the people who control what is a cause and what's not a cause, then you don't have to worry about individuals rising up, grassroots individuals rising up and explaining how events really occur. And also, I think Germany has all the mythic elements on its side, both 80 years ago and today. And the attempt by the Allies, or whatever is left of the Allies, to sort of create a mythology out of World War II is sort of a ham-fisted response to a more well thought out mythological creation by the National Socialists. Because Hitler, the individual, has on his side the idea of the once and future king that you have with the Arthur legend, of someone who probably should have lived longer. This is an idea, the archetype, not necessarily Hitler himself, but was cut off before he finished his creation of Camelot. And you also have sort of this connection to the earth, or connection to a people that goes back into the mist of time, that appeals to, I think, everyone who is not totally infected by distractions of the modern era, by technological distractions, which I think most people in their gut know are not of the essence of human being. They're just sort of add-ons. I would say that the technical expression of human being is not the essential, does not come from the essential part. So I guess I'm against the sort of the version of Prometheanism that includes this technological explanation or I guess expansion. To me, it's more of the spiritual expansion. It just happens to use technology at times and different kinds of technology. But the larger point is that with Hitler and with the Nazis, you had this mythic component that was more well thought out. And since then, you can watch the History Channel or all these other channels, YouTube videos, always trying to create an anti-mythology that doesn't quite match the thoroughness of the mythology created and appropriated by Nazi Germany. And I began noticing this several years ago, just watching the History Channel, how often they talk about how powerful the Nazi regime was. Now, why would you do that? Why would you do that repeatedly all the time, talking about how powerful they were? Because I think most people root for the underdog. And if you don't think that's the underdog, then maybe you are less likely to root for them or to try to understand them in some way. And so I think there's been, again, whatever your opinion is on the Nazi regime, I think there's been an attempt to take that away from it also, to say it's not the underdog, that it was actually more powerful, even though it was a small country, relatively speaking, and that they were the empire, the Galactic Empire, not the Allies. When in fact, if you look at the numbers and the assets and everything, obviously the Allies would fall into the position of the Galactic Empire, just based upon facts.
Yes, Charles, thank you very much. And one thing that is very striking, of course, in all of these documentaries, so-called, on the Second World War and the rise of Hitler, is that they say that they had, fighting forces in the streets intimidating the population to voting for them. But that's completely misrepresenting what was happening. There was brutal fighting in the streets between all of the factions, between communists and National Socialists and stuff like that. And Leon de Grelle famously said that at least 500 people of the NSDAP were murdered by communist anarchists and all kinds of factions. So to understand that the phenomenon of Hitler rose out of the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and that he actually got a movement off the ground and to get people to vote for him, is an unbelievable achievement. And John F. Kennedy, this Democrat sweetheart, actually said that when the mists of time have receded, then Hitler will be known as one of the greatest men who has ever lived.
Absolutely, yes.
Not to be a fanboy here, but just as you said, the mythical component is so appealing. And just as a closing statement, I really do not like the American Constitution. But the First Amendment may very well prove to be the salvation of the entire West in this regard, because it's the number one thing still making it possible in white countries, some white countries at least, to discuss these matters. Because, mind you, in Austria, a man has been sentenced to jail for 11 years for simply possessing Nazi books and spreading Nazi movie clips to his friends on whatever social media. 11 fucking years, to be blunt, in a prison for such things. And yeah, that's what I said. I really think that the First Amendment is going to be the saving component, because it allows the internet to disperse this information. And I think that there are enormous amounts of people actually being closet fanboys. So we are approaching the hour, and as Zoom only allows recording for 1 hour, if anybody has any closing statements to make, then I would like to thank the audience for this episode, and we enjoyed that you are watching us, and we hope that you have enjoyed watching us. I already said that, but I meant the other way around. So thank you, and until the next time.